Montana Territory, October 1883. While his neighbors rushed to notch logs and raise timber frames before the first snow, Duncan MacLeod did something that made absolutely no sense to anyone watching. The 52-year-old Scottish stonemason began hauling sandstone blocks, each weighing between 40 and 60 pounds, to a flat clearing 2 miles west of the settlement. Not for a foundation, not for a chimney, for walls, 16 feet in diameter, 24 inches thick. "He's building a damn grain silo," one homesteader muttered, watching MacLeod work his trowel with the precision of a jeweler. In October, with winter breathing down our necks, what they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that MacLeod wasn't just stacking stone. He was building a fortress against cold that would outlast, outperform, and ultimately outlive every log cabin within 50 miles. But first, he'd have to survive their laughter. If you want to discover the engineering secret that turned Mockery into mastery, the same principle that could revolutionize how we think about heating today, hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because what I'm about to show you isn't just history. It's a blueprint for survival that the modern world forgot. And I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll never look at stone the same way again. Duncan MacLeod had arrived in Montana Territory in the spring of 1883 with little more than his tools, his reputation as a stonemason, and memories of Highland winters that could kill a man in his sleep. He'd spent 20 years in Scotland building dry stone walls, root cellars, and the kind of fortified crofts that kept families alive when storms turned the moors into frozen wastelands. But Montana wasn't Scotland. The terrain was harsher, the winters were longer, and the community of homesteaders gathering near the Bitterroot Valley had already decided how things should be done. Logs, chinked with mud and moss, sealed with whatever pitch you could scrape from pines, and heated with a stone hearth or iron stove if you could afford one. MacLeod looked at their plans and saw death traps. Logs dried and cracked. Chinking failed. Heat escaped through 1,000 invisible gaps, and families burned through cords of wood just to keep temperatures above freezing. He'd seen it before, pioneers so busy feeding fires they had no time to hunt, trap, or prepare food. Winters where survival became a math problem. How much wood can you cut before the snow gets too deep? How much can you burn before you run out? He proposed something different. "I'll build in stone," he told the settlements in formal council in late September, his accent still thick with the Highlands. "A tower, 16 feet across, walls 2 feet thick, a central firebox with channels running through the base. It'll hold heat longer than any cabin you've seen." The room went silent. Then someone laughed. "Stone," said Raymond Kerr, a master carpenter who'd built homes in Minnesota for a decade. "You'll freeze to death, old man. Stone draws cold like a sponge draws water. You need wood, insulation, air gaps, not a pile of rocks." MacLeod didn't argue. He'd learned long ago that some men only believed what winter taught them. So he nodded, thanked them for their time, and went back to hauling stone. By mid-October, while his neighbors were finishing their log walls and carving out window frames, MacLeod was still laying his foundation, a ring of limestone sunk 3 feet into the earth, backfilled with gravel for drainage. People rode past just to stare. Some shook their heads. Others made jokes. "He's building a monument to his own stupidity," one trapper said. But MacLeod kept working. And as the first snow began to fall in early November, the stone tower began to rise, slow, deliberate, and utterly unlike anything the valley had ever seen. What Duncan MacLeod understood, what his critics couldn't see, was that stone and wood don't just differ in strength. They differ in how they hold, move, and release heat. And in a climate where winter temperatures could swing 40 degrees between day and night, that difference wasn't academic. It was the difference between comfort and suffering, between survival and death. Wood is an insulator. It resists heat transfer, which sounds good until you realize that means it also resists storing heat. A log wall might keep cold air out for a few hours, but the moment your fire dies, the cabin starts losing warmth. There's no thermal battery, no reserve. You're burning wood to heat air, and air doesn't remember warmth. It just escapes through every crack, seam, and gap you couldn't seal. Stone is different. Specifically, the sandstone McLeod quarried from a ridge for miles north. Sandstone has a volumetric heat capacity of roughly 0.17 BTU per cubic inch per degree Fahrenheit. That means every cubic foot of McLeod's walls, and he was building walls 2 feet thick, could absorb and store around 30 BTUs of heat energy per degree of temperature rise. Do the math. A 16-foot diameter tower with walls 24 inches thick, rising 12 feet high, contains approximately 4,200 pounds of stone. Heat that stone mass from 40 degrees Fahrenheit to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and you've stored over 126,000 BTUs of energy. That's equivalent to burning nearly 4 pounds of dry firewood. But the difference is the stone releases that heat slowly, over hours, radiating warmth long after the flames die down. McLeod didn't talk about BTUs. He didn't have the vocabulary. But he knew from experience that a stone cottage in the Highlands stayed warm through the night, while wooden shanties turned frigid by dawn. So he designed his tower accordingly. The firebox sat dead center, not against a wall where half the heat would escape outside, but in the middle of the structure where every calorie of combustion would transfer into the surrounding stone. He built it low, just 18 inches off the ground, and surrounded it with a ring of river stones that he'd collected all summer, carefully selecting rounded granite and basalt for their density and heat retention. From the firebox, he carved shallow channels into the stone floor, spiraling outward like the arms of a galaxy. The hot air and smoke would travel through these channels before venting through a chimney on the north side, the coldest side, the side that needed the most heat transfer. As the smoke moved through the channels, the floor absorbed its warmth. Then, for the next 10 to 12 hours, that floor would radiate heat upward, turning the entire tower into a slow-release furnace. The walls themselves were double-mortared. Inner surface, outer surface, and a core of smaller stones packed tight with lime mortar mixed with clay. This wasn't just for strength. The mass created a thermal gradient. The inner surface warmed quickly from the fire, the core absorbed and held that heat, and the outer surface remained cold enough to minimize heat loss to the outside air. By late November, the tower was finished. McLeod installed a single wooden door on the south side, cut one small window facing east for morning light, and built a sleeping loft along the western curve of the wall. The roof was sod over timber beams, another layer of insulation and thermal mass. Neighbors came to see it. Most didn't stay long. "Looks like a grain silo," one said. "Or a tomb," muttered another. Raymond Kerr, the master carpenter, stood in the doorway and shook his head. "You've built yourself an oven, McLeod, and come January, you're going to bake. Or freeze. Either way, it's madness." McLeod just smiled. "We'll see," he said quietly. "We'll see." Raymond Kerr wasn't just skeptical. He was offended. A man who'd spent 30 years perfecting the craft of timber frame construction didn't appreciate some old stonemason showing up and implying that everyone had been doing it wrong. So Kerr made it his business to explain, loudly and often, why McLeod's tower was doomed to fail. Stone conducts cold, Kerr announced at the settlement's Sunday gathering in early December. You put your hand on a log wall in winter, it feels warm. You put your hand on stone, it pulls the heat right out of your skin. That's physics. That's not opinion. He wasn't entirely wrong. Stone does have higher thermal conductivity than wood. Touch a cold stone surface, and it will draw heat from your hand faster than wood would. But Kerr made the mistake of confusing surface sensation with overall performance. He didn't understand thermal mass. He didn't account for radiant heat. And he certainly didn't consider that McLeod's design wasn't about the surface. It was about the volume. Others joined the chorus. Calvin Hodge, a homesteader from Ohio who'd survived 3 brutal winters in a log cabin, shook his head whenever McLeod's name came up. "I've burned 6 cords of wood every winter just to keep my family from freezing. And I've got gap-sealed, proper chinking a cast-iron stove. That fool's living in a stone icebox with a campfire in the middle. He'll be burning 10 cords if he lives that long." Even the settlement's informal leader, a former Army quartermaster named Samuel Pritchard, weighed in. "I admire the man's work ethic," Pritchard said carefully, "but I'd never recommend his approach. Wood is tried and true. We know it works. Stone? That's an experiment. And winter's no time for experiments. The betting started in mid-December. Not with money. Most homesteaders didn't have spare cash, but with goods and labor. Calvin Hodge bet a smoked ham that McLeod would abandon the tower by February. Raymond Kerr wagered 2 days of carpentry work that McLeod's firewood consumption would exceed his own. A trapper named Eugene Ferris put up a beaver pelt on the assumption that McLeod's interior temperature would never break 50 degrees Fahrenheit during the coldest weeks. McLeod heard the rumors. He knew what people were saying, but he'd spent enough winters watching fools talk and wise men work to let it bother him. He stocked his tower with firewood, not the massive cords his neighbors were piling up, but modest stacks of split pine and Douglas fir, carefully dried and stored inside where moisture couldn't reach it. He also did something strange. He collected rocks, smooth river stones the size of bread loaves, which he stacked near the firebox. When asked why, he just shrugged. "Old Highland trick," he said. "You'll see." By Christmas, the temperature had dropped into the teens. By New Year, it was flirting with zero. The log cabins were burning wood faster than anyone had anticipated. Families huddled near their stoves and hearths, wrapped in every blanket they owned, watching their wood piles shrink and wondering if they'd miscalculated. And in the stone tower, Duncan McLeod sat comfortably in his shirt sleeves, reading by candlelight, while his fire burned low and steady in the center of the room. January 1884 arrived like a predator. The cold came from the north in waves. First a sharp drop into single digits, then a brief reprieve, then a plunge that shattered thermometers and froze whiskey solid in the bottle. On January 9th, the temperature hit minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. On the 11th, it touched minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And on the morning of January 14th, Samuel Pritchard's mercury thermometer, the only reliable instrument in the settlement, registered minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit just after dawn. That was cold enough to kill. Calvin Hodge woke that morning to find ice on the inside of his cabin walls. His cast-iron stove, fed constantly through the night by his eldest son, radiated heat in a narrow 3-foot radius, but the far corners of the room hovered barely above freezing. His wife wrapped the younger children in elk hides and kept them pressed against the stove's metal flanks. The family burned through half a cord of wood in 18 hours. Raymond Kerr's cabin fared slightly better. His construction was tighter, his chinking more thorough, but even he couldn't keep the interior above 48 degrees Fahrenheit without burning wood so fast his hands cramped from splitting. His wife complained that her breath fogged even next to the hearth. His children slept in layers of wool, pressed together for warmth. Across the settlement, it was the same story. Fires roaring, wood disappearing, families rationing their stockpiles and praying for a thaw. And then someone rode past McLeod's tower. It was Eugene Ferris, the trapper, checking his line in the brutal cold. He'd bundled himself in furs until he looked like a walking bear, and even then his face stung with every gust of wind. As he passed McLeod's stone structure, he noticed something odd. No massive plume of smoke, just a thin, lazy ribbon rising from the chimney. Ferris reined in his horse. That didn't make sense. If McLeod was burning enough wood to survive, there should be thick smoke. Unless McLeod was already frozen. Ferris dismounted and approached the tower. He pressed his ear to the stone wall, listening for signs of life. What he felt instead shocked him. Warmth. Not scorching heat, but a gentle, unmistakable warmth radiating from the stone itself. He knocked on the wooden door. It opened almost immediately. Duncan McLeod stood there in wool trousers and a linen shirt. No coat, no blankets. His face relaxed and slightly flushed. Behind him, the interior of the tower glowed with soft, even warmth. The fire in the central firebox was small, almost modest, just a few burning logs surrounded by those river stones McLeod had collected, now radiating a dull red heat. "Eugene," McLeod said pleasantly. "Cold enough for you?" Ferris stared. He couldn't reconcile what he was seeing. Outside, minus 38 degrees. Inside, a man in shirt sleeves, comfortable calm, with a fire that looked like it belonged in autumn, not the depths of a killing winter. "Ow!" Ferris began, but the words stuck in his throat. McLeod smiled. Come in. Warm yourself. I'll put on tea. Ferris stepped inside, and the door closed behind him. The warmth enveloped him immediately. Not the searing blast of a roaring stove, but a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The floor, the walls, the air itself. He pulled off his gloves and placed a hand on the stone wall. It was warm to the touch. Not hot, just warm, like sun-baked rock in summer. How much wood are you burning? Ferris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. McLeod shrugged. 3, maybe 4 pieces every few hours. I built the fire up this morning around 5. Added a couple logs at 8. Won't need more until noon, I'd say. Ferris did the math in his head. That was a fraction, a tiny fraction, of what every other cabin was consuming. And yet McLeod's tower was warmer than any structure in the valley. I need to tell the others, Ferris said. McLeod nodded. Tell them, he said quietly, but tell them the truth. This isn't magic. It's just stone, and stone remembers heat. Before we reveal the exact measurements that stunned the entire settlement, the numbers that turned skeptics into believers, I need you to do something. Pause right now and drop a comment with your guess. How much warmer do you think McLeod's tower was compared to the log cabins? 10 degrees? 20? More? Comment your answer. Hit that like button and subscribe, because what comes next is going to change how you think about building forever. Word spread fast in a settlement of 43 souls. By mid-afternoon on January 14th, a small crowd had gathered outside McLeod's stone tower, breath fogging in the brutal air, faces wrapped against wind that could strip skin. They came to see for themselves, to verify what Eugene Ferris had reported, to understand what seemed impossible. Samuel Pritchard arrived with his mercury thermometer and a notebook. As the settlement's de facto record keeper and a man who'd managed supply logistics for an army regiment, he understood the value of documentation. If McLeod's design actually worked, if it wasn't some fluke or exaggeration, then it needed to be measured, recorded, and understood. Duncan, Pritchard called out, knocking on the tower door. May I take some readings? McLeod opened the door and gestured him inside. The warmth hit Pritchard immediately, and he paused, momentarily disoriented by the transition from -38 to what felt like a summer evening. He blinked, letting his eyes adjust to the dimmer interior. The tower's design became clear. The central firebox, built low and surrounded by those heated river stones, now glowing with stored thermal energy. The spiral channels carved into the stone floor, barely visible but clearly functional, distributing heat outward from the center. The thick stone walls, their inner surfaces radiating gentle warmth. And the ceiling, sod over timber, acting as a final insulating cap. Pritchard held up his thermometer and waited for the mercury to stabilize. When it did, he checked it twice, then wrote in his notebook, interior temperature, 68 degrees Fahrenheit at 2:15 p.m., January 14th, 1884. He stepped back outside, where the crowd waited. He held up the thermometer for them to see the outdoor reading, -36 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature had risen slightly since dawn, but it was still cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes. 68 degrees inside, Pritchard announced. Measured at the center of the room, approximately 6 feet from the firebox. The crowd murmured. Raymond Kerr pushed forward, his face skeptical beneath his wool scarf. And how much wood is he burning to maintain that? Pritchard looked at McLeod, who'd followed them outside. McLeod gestured to a small stack of split logs near the tower's entrance. That's what I've burned since yesterday evening. About 16 pieces, maybe 18 pounds total. Calvin Hodge stepped forward, his expression somewhere between disbelief and anger. 18 pounds? I've burned 80 pounds since yesterday. 80, and my cabin's barely holding 45 degrees. 44 this morning, his wife added quietly from behind him, holding their youngest child bundled in blankets. The water bucket froze solid overnight. Pritchard made more notes. Over the next hour, he visited 3 other cabins to take comparative readings. The results were consistent and stark. Calvin Hodge's cabin, 44 degrees Fahrenheit interior, estimated 80 pounds of wood burned in 18 hours. Raymond Kerr's cabin, 52 degrees Fahrenheit interior. Estimated 65 pounds of wood burned in 18 hours. Eugene Ferris's cabin. 48 degrees Fahrenheit interior. Estimated 70 pounds of wood burned in 18 hours. Duncan MacLeod's tower. 68 degrees Fahrenheit interior. Estimated 18 pounds of wood burned in 18 hours. The mathematics were undeniable. MacLeod was maintaining an interior temperature 16 to 24 degrees warmer than his neighbors, while consuming less than a quarter of their firewood. The temperature differential between outside and inside was 104 degrees Fahrenheit in MacLeod's tower compared to 80 to 88 degrees Fahrenheit in the log cabins, a 20 to 30% improvement in thermal performance. But the most dramatic discovery came that night. Pritchard asked MacLeod if he could conduct an experiment. Let the fire die completely and measure how long the tower retained warmth. MacLeod agreed. At 6 p.m., MacLeod added one final log to his firebox. At 8 p.m., he let the fire burn down to coals. By 9 p.m., the flames were completely extinguished. Pritchard stayed to monitor. He took temperature readings every hour. 9 p.m., 66 degrees Fahrenheit. 10 p.m., 64 degrees Fahrenheit. 11 p.m., 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Midnight. 60 degrees Fahrenheit. 1 a.m., 58 degrees Fahrenheit. 2 a.m., 56 degrees Fahrenheit. 3 a.m., 54 degrees Fahrenheit. 4 a.m., 52 degrees Fahrenheit. 5 a.m., 51 degrees Fahrenheit. 11 hours. The tower had maintained a temperature above 50 degrees Fahrenheit for 11 hours with no active fire. The stone mass, those 4,200 pounds of heated sandstone, was releasing its stored thermal energy at a rate of approximately 1.4 degrees per hour, creating a slow, gentle decline rather than the rapid temperature crash that occurred in wooden structures. Pritchard had witnessed similar tests in log cabins. Without an active fire, most dropped below 50 degrees Fahrenheit within 2 to 3 hours. Some, with poor chinking or thin walls, dropped even faster. He wrote in his notebook, MacLeod's stone tower demonstrates heat retention capacity approximately 350 to 400% greater than conventional log construction, with consumption reduced by approximately 75%. Interior comfort dramatically superior. Conclusion: thermal mass construction represents significant advantage in extreme cold climates. Then he added one more line. Previous assumptions about stone's unsuitability for cold weather housing appear to have been incorrect. The next morning, Raymond Kerr knocked on MacLeod's door. His pride had kept him away the day before, but necessity and honesty brought him back. When MacLeod answered, Kerr spoke without preamble. I was wrong, he said simply. I don't understand how it works, but I was wrong. Will you teach me? MacLeod smiled. Come in, Raymond. We'll start with the basics. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened with the certainty of spring following winter. By late January, Duncan MacLeod's stone tower had become the settlement's most visited structure, not for skepticism, but for education. Men who'd mocked him 2 months earlier now sat in his warm interior, notebooks in hand, asking questions about mortar mix, stone selection, firebox placement, and thermal channel design. MacLeod taught freely. He had no interest in hoarding knowledge or claiming superiority. He'd simply built what he knew worked, and now that others wanted to learn, he shared everything. Raymond Kerr became his most dedicated student. The master carpenter had spent 3 decades perfecting timber frame construction, and at first, the principles of thermal mass felt almost alien to him. But Kerr was a practical man, and practical men follow results. Within 2 weeks, he'd sketched plans for incorporating stone mass into his existing cabin, a hybrid design that would combine the quick construction of log walls with the heat retention of stone. I can't rebuild my whole cabin, Kerr told MacLeod one evening, watching the older man arrange river stones around his firebox. But I can add a stone hearth, a real one, 2 feet deep, 4 feet wide, built into the corner where my iron stove sits. If I surround the stove with thermal mass, it'll hold heat through the night, MacLeod finished. Exactly. You're thinking like a Highlander now. Kerr built his modified hearth in February. The difference was immediate. Where before his stove had radiated heat in a tight radius, The stone mass absorbed warmth during the evening burn and released it for hours after the fire died. His wood consumption dropped by nearly 40%. His family slept through the night without waking to feed the fire. Calvin Hodge took a different approach. His cabin was poorly positioned. He'd built in a low spot where cold air pooled, and no amount of stone would fix that fundamental error. But he had a root cellar that stayed consistently cool, and McLeod showed him how to use thermal mass in reverse. Bury large stones in the cellar during winter, and they'd absorb any excess warmth that seeped down from above, keeping his stored vegetables from freezing even when surface temperatures dropped below zero. Eugene Ferris, the trapper, couldn't afford to build a stone structure. He was rarely home anyway, but he adopted McLeod's river stone technique for his temporary camps. He'd collect smooth stones during the day, heat them in his evening fire, then wrap them in leather and place them in his bedroll. The stones held warmth for 6 to 8 hours, transforming his sleeping comfort on the trapline. By spring of 1884, 7 homesteaders had incorporated some form of thermal mass into their heating systems. By autumn, that number had grown to 12. And when winter returned in late 1884, the settlement's collective firewood consumption had dropped by an estimated 30%. The knowledge spread beyond the immediate settlement. Travelers and traders carried stories of the Scottish stonemason's heated tower up and down the Bitterroot Valley. A family 20 miles south built a smaller stone dwelling based on McLeod's description. A logging camp 30 miles north added a stone hearth to their bunkhouse and reported dramatic improvements in overnight heat retention. In 1885, a surveyor named Marcus Webb documented 17 structures within a 50-mile radius that had incorporated what locals were calling the McLeod method, some variation of thermal mass heating designed to store and release warmth more efficiently than conventional wood-burning systems. Webb interviewed McLeod for his regional report. "Did you invent this?" Webb asked, gesturing to the tower's design. McLeod shook his head. "No more than I invented stone or fire. The Highlanders have built like this for centuries. The principle's older than that. Romans used hypocausts. Koreans had ondal systems. Russians built masonry stoves that heated whole houses from one daily firing. I just brought the knowledge here and proved it worked in Montana cold." "And the Mockery?" Webb asked. How did that feel when they finally understood? McLeod considered the question. "I didn't build this to prove anyone wrong," he said finally. "I built it to survive. The validation was nice, I suppose. But the real satisfaction came from knowing that families were warmer, safer, using less wood, suffering less. Knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied." Webb noted that in his report. Then he added his own observation. McLeod's stone tower, initially derided as impractical, has proven to be one of the most efficient cold-weather dwellings in the Montana Territory. It has survived the winter of 1884, the coldest on record, and has fundamentally changed how this settlement approaches winter heating. More importantly, it has demonstrated the value of traditional building knowledge in frontier conditions. The tower itself stood for 43 years. It outlasted most of the log cabins built in 1883, when it finally came down in 1927, not from structural failure, but from deliberate demolition to make way for a modern road. The stones were salvaged and used to build a community hearth in the town's new church. Raymond Kerr, by then an old man himself, helped lay those stones. "Duncan would have liked this," he said to no one in particular, his hands still steady with a trowel despite his age. He'd shared. Knowledge passed on. Nothing wasted. There's a lesson in Duncan McLeod's story that goes beyond stone and fire, beyond thermal mass and BTU calculations. It's a lesson about humility, about the danger of dismissing knowledge simply because it comes from the past, or from unfamiliar sources, or from quiet men who'd rather build than argue. When McLeod arrived in Montana Territory, he brought with him centuries of Highland building wisdom. Knowledge refined through generations of bitter winters, scarce resources, and the unforgiving feedback of survival. That knowledge wasn't primitive. It wasn't backwards. It was engineering, distilled to its essence, and proven through the most rigorous test imaginable. Human life in extreme conditions. The experts who mocked him weren't stupid. Raymond Kerr was a skilled carpenter. Calvin Hodge had survived multiple winters. They knew construction. They understood their craft. But they'd made the mistake of assuming that their way, the way they'd learned, the way that was common in their experience, was the only way. The best way. The right way. They'd confused familiarity with superiority. MacLeod didn't argue with them because he didn't need to. He understood something fundamental about knowledge. It doesn't care about ego. Physics doesn't negotiate. Thermal mass works whether you believe in it or not. Stone stores heat whether you understand the mechanism or not. And winter, brutal, honest, indifferent winter, reveals truth with absolute clarity. The same principle MacLeod used in his Montana tower exists in countless traditional building methods around the world. The Russian masonry stove, the pechka, could heat a home for 24 hours from a single 2-hour firing, using the same thermal mass principle. The Korean ondol system ran heated air beneath stone floors, turning the entire floor into a radiant heater. Japanese farmhouses used irori, sunken hearths surrounded by stone, to create zones of warmth that lingered through cold nights. Even the adobe structures of the American Southwest employed thermal mass, though for cooling rather than heating. These weren't accidents. They weren't lucky guesses. They were solutions, engineered over generations by people who couldn't afford to be wrong because failure meant death. Modern construction has largely abandoned these principles in favor of active heating systems. Furnaces, boilers, forced air that require constant energy input. We've traded efficiency for convenience, and in doing so, we've lost something valuable. Not because old ways are automatically better, but because they contained hard-won wisdom about working with natural systems rather than against them. Duncan MacLeod's stone tower didn't just outperform the log cabins in the winter of 1884. It demonstrated a truth that every generation seems to need to relearn. Dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often reveals not their ignorance, but ours. The men who laughed at MacLeod weren't malicious. They were simply blind to possibilities outside their experience. And when winter forced their eyes open, most of them had the integrity to admit they'd been wrong and the wisdom to learn from it. That's the real story here. Not that an old stonemason built a better shelter, though he did. Not that thermal mass outperforms hollow insulation in extreme cold, though it does. The story is about the courage to pursue knowledge even when surrounded by skepticism, the humility to learn from other traditions, and the honesty to revise your beliefs when evidence demands it. MacLeod Tower is gone now, but the principle remains. Somewhere in Montana, there are still stone hearths built to his design. Still hybrid structures incorporating thermal mass. Still families staying warmer, using less fuel, because one Scottish stonemason refused to forget what his ancestors had learned about stone and fire. And perhaps that's the greatest validation of all. Knowledge that works doesn't die. It waits, quiet and patient, for the next person wise enough to listen. If this story changed how you think about traditional knowledge, about survival engineering, or about the arrogance of dismissing the old ways without understanding them first, then do me a favor. Hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of forgotten wisdom proven right. And drop a comment telling me, what traditional skill or knowledge do you think modern society needs to rediscover? Because I guarantee you, there are more Duncan MacLeods out there. More quiet masters with solutions we've forgotten how to see. And together, we're going to find them. Thanks for watching. Stay warm. And remember, the past isn't primitive. It's just proven.